thank you all so much, and especially PAI for inviting me to give this talk, and especially for giving me the chance to give the talk I'm about to give at the Amazon offices. Was not on my bingo card, but here we are. So it's a really, I would say, profoundly important time for AI policy in the public interest, not just to advocate for it, but equally to call out what isn't it. So if there's anything I've learned in the last 2 years, and the heart of policy conversations on AI, it's that sort of these weighty words like regulation, innovation, and openness can very easily get sort of diluted, co-opted, and sometimes entirely lose meaning. So a lot of our work has actually been to try and claw back to the specifics. So yes, in theory, both Sam Altman and I are both pro-AI regulation, but maybe it's worthwhile to push through and pierce through that fuzzy consensus. And pushing for consensus to fall apart definitely runs counterintuitive to the diplomacy that we're all trained in, and I'm guilty as much as many of you all are in that tradition. But I do think that one thing we've learned over the last few years is that in a market that is constituted by and almost defined by concentrated power in a very small section of the tech industry, holding industry to account actually requires a public strategy that heightens the contradictions so that lawmakers and public officials can tell the difference between what meaningfully challenges tech power versus what allows for business as usual, while often giving the illusion of progress. So in 2023, the policy landscape was quite unique in that at the height of both the sort of euphoria, but also the panic around this new generation of AI, we sort of saw two camps within Silicon Valley, often overlapping and maybe without exception industry affiliated, occupying both poles of the debate. The AI boom and doom spokespeople felt like they were both cut from the same cloth. So we think back to major tech CEOs and others giving official statements that we should be afraid, very afraid, because these systems are just that powerful, and that therefore regulation was the need of the hour. And that's where I would want to sort of activate our smell test for public interest policy and what is it and what it isn't, and reveal why sort of neither end of this boom versus doom debate were it, in my opinion. For one, they were both sort of reinforcing an empirically very, very shaky claim that this kind of AI that we were seeing on the market was a stepping stone, who knows how long or how broad, to artificial general intelligence as an inevitability. And in doing so, they were characterizing AI as a national strategic asset that had to be guarded at all costs from any efforts at introducing friction. So under this sort of AI arms race logic, any friction, regulatory friction, is slowing us down in a race with geopolitical significance. Number two, they both sides of this debate sort of reinforced that nobody understood and was better placed to tackle the concerns and risks from these technologies than industry leaders themselves, making sure that often civil society and independent research voices were relegated, and I'm going to be a bit facetious here, but to the kids' table, right? To discuss issues like material unsolved privacy and security lapses, the devaluation of work, of creative industries, of competition, the degradation of our information environment, while the big boys got to talk about the existential threats to the future of humanity. Finally, when we actually scrutinize this pro-regulation stance, the details where they exist do seem to fall apart, and they also reinforce very narrow industry interests. Firstly, we saw these hazy calls for licensing come from many companies, but one in particular, which was kind of kryptonite, right? You would think for anyone in the corporate policy world, so it caught everyone by surprise. But if you think about it, it really was like sort of allowing companies that were already at the top to kind of shut the door behind them. Second, this sort of narrow focus on a very particular kind of future-looking risk and a very narrow class of AI also meant that compute became a threshold for scoping much of the policy that we were discussing, which was both a sort of poor proxy for risk itself, as many researchers have credibly pointed out. But the kind of effective outcome of that move was to sort of exclude wide swaths of AI that is already on the market, already affecting people from regulatory scrutiny. The final bit of the smell test is, of course, distinguishing the should statements, the strive to statements, from the shall statements. And of course, all are required in policy discourse. But what we found is the more abstract conversation about voluntary governance was often being used to both undercut and overshadow a much more sort of growing drumbeat of public pressure on the need for enforceable laws. So even as the multiple voluntary commitments signed in multiple parts of the world are absolutely better than none at all, we do remain concerned that these are sort of often being used as a stalling tactic by industry lobbies to sort of stall progress towards both new regulation with teeth, but also actionable enforcement of existing laws. At the UK AI Summit this year, I asked a very simple question in the room that I was in, curated on social harms, which was, where are the enforcers? We've seen enforcement agencies globally take on very strong stances in the aftermath of this new generation of AI, whether that's France's early investigation into NVIDIA, the FTC and DOJ's interrogation of unconventional business models. The Italian Data Protection Authority was first out of the door with ChatGPT, and yet there's sort of, in comparison, their notable absence or erasure from many high-level conversations on AI governance is telling. So amidst this heightened debate, AI Now, along with Epic and Accountable Tech, offered provocatively instead for a zero trust framework in 2023. We put forward an actionable manifesto that focused instead on bright line rules for privacy, security, and competition, sort of putting the burden back on companies to demonstrate that their products were in fact safe for commercial release. Trust is key, but I would argue or even push back that in policy spaces, it must not just be earned, it must be guaranteed structurally. Where there is a fork in the road, and we say this in many of the rooms we are in, companies should be trusted not to leave money on the table. So looking ahead, this is where we're at. This is going to be another very big year for AI governance. I wanted to highlight maybe the top three tactics I think those of us engaged in policy in the public interest should sort of be embracing. The first is concreteness, rigor, and details in the face of abstractions that are often used to obscure the public in public interest or the open in open source. In a year when mythology has sort of eclipsed even the need for any semblance of a viable business model, it really helps to get material and concrete to combat speculation and combat the sort of abstract with the material. The second is to say that actually facts will not get us all the way there, and the calls for civil society and independent research to keep producing more and more evidence of harm is in some ways a trap, given that we already have a decade worth of receipts from automated decision systems and the kind of concerns that they manifest in person. So what we need is not more facts, but really a positive vision for innovation and a positive narrative on this side as well. Innovation, like regulation, cannot just be an empty signifier that is sort of wielded almost as a gag order against calls for accountability. And so we need to give it the material content to illuminate an alternative vision for innovation, one that isn't the dominion of technologists or Silicon Valley alone. It needs to go broader than these two camps, and we need to put all questions back on the table when it comes to innovation, including questioning whether this particular paradigm of particularly like large-scale AI is economically or ecologically sustainable long-term. So who decides that Google's AI answers that apparently cost 30 times as much energy to generate text as compared to regular search is the right trade-off for the planet and for future generations? What are the alternative R&D trajectories that we can't see because the market isn't incentivized to go there? So finally, I think for all of these conversations, we need public interest advocates and researchers to have more than a seat at the table, because we've sort of come up at the limits of that type of discourse. As over 50 plus organizations, including our own, wrote this year in response to a bipartisan AI roadmap led by Majority Leader Schumer, the public doesn't or is no longer satisfied with a seat at the table. The public needs to be in the driver's seat on this conversation. I take inspiration here from those like the National Nurses United, the Nurses Union, who have made very clear in their AI Bill of Rights that they are actually at the front lines of defending quality in patient care and asserting their expertise as leaders on AI, deciding whether and how it should be used in clinical contexts. So the opportunity here and the thing that makes us really excited is there's an opportunity to sort of reimagine who counts as expert in conversations about AI so that we can all, in a more broad-based way, be active participants in shaping the trajectory of this tech rather than passive consumers of it. So I think to conclude, I'll say it's counterintuitive, but let's not focus on where there is consensus with industry, especially controversial maybe in this room, but where there isn't. Getting clearer on the reasons why will, I think, move us from having a public interest seat at the AI table to having a public interest table and then figuring out where AI fits in that vision. Thank you.
And again, we've got time for a couple of questions.
Hi, Amba. Catherine Bracing from Tech Equity. Yes, actually. Yes to everything you said. We're doing a lot of work on the ground in California right now, like in the weeds with negotiations and blocking and tackling on the politics with industry on a variety of bills. It is my sense that people who are really steeped in this at the high-level policy tables and at the academic and research tables do not understand when they are maybe unwittingly carrying water for industry and reinforcing the goals of industry to maintain the status quo, which is to say no regulation at all.
Yeah.
I think it might be helpful maybe for you to like point out some specific red flags that you see, like when you as an academic or a policymaker see industry doing X, that's a red flag, and you should be clear that what they may be asking you to do or what they are trying to do is stall or have you sort of validate their point of view.
Yeah, I think thank you also for, Catherine, for bringing up California, because I think there's no better example than the debate around SB 107 as an example of where the kind of public interest voice is a little bit being lost within two warring camps within Silicon Valley. I think in terms of like what is the strategic, like, you know, what I was trying to call out in my talk was the smell test is really abstraction. So we are pro accountability and pro regulation in general, but which risks do we really care about? Whose interests are we repping? And maybe the most important question to ask in all of these debates is which constituency is behind any particular argument? I think every time we do that, and SB 107 is a very good example, you sort of peel back the onion and you do find that, you know, both of these, all roads in some ways lead back to the same kinds of industry interests. I think that equally, apart from the sort of digging and interrogating, is all of us doing the policy in the public interest side of things, getting louder, more effective with our own narrative strategy that isn't just always in reflexive mode. I think we've gotten out of that to some degree, but also setting forth a positive vision, because speaking of California, I've had journalists ask me, but you're for tech accountability, so why are you not on X side of this debate? Because obviously, X must follow from Y. And so I think really reclaiming that ground on here is what our vision is, here are who our constituencies are, and having that create much needed clarity, I think, in the public discourse.
Thank you very much for your, and I'll say, yeah, woo, that was a great talk.
Thank you.
So I want to ask a similar question, but this is more specific. Sorry, Jane, Carnegie Endowment, Africa Program. I'm Jane with the Carnegie Endowment for Africa. So I want to ask something close more about Africa case, because this problem is so real, and sometimes it's because it's a vacuum. Policymakers don't necessarily have the knowledge, the concepts of AI, and when the policy is being made. There's a lot of industry interest, and they sit in these stakeholder meetings, and they have the louder voices. They come in with memos. So they have a very strong, influential voice when the policy is making. So I want to flip this question and ask you, what is the message for policymakers? How can we try and enable the policymakers in the space, especially in developing countries where AI is not so mature, the ecosystems are not so mature, to ensure that it's truly a public interest policy? So what are some of those steps, the recommendations that you'd make?
Yeah, thank you. I think the answer, and I would say this is true both in the global north and in the global majority, is that resist the idea that there is any kind of vacuum around AI regulation to begin with, because that sort of blank slate characterization serves industry interests more than it does anyone else. There are actually a lot of laws in the books, including foundational laws on data protection, on competition, that absolutely can, should, and are already being leveraged to regulate this space. So I think first, we remind regulators all over the world, including, in the African continent, there are more countries that have a data protection law than don't, to say actually these enforcers need to be properly resourced, and they need to be emboldened to draw lines in the sand and apply the law in imaginative and bold ways. So I would say that's first, and the second would be, I think, to as much as possible there's the enforce side, on the build side, I think really push for a more broad-based concept of what counts as expertise in conversations on AI, like I mentioned. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This is going to sound weird coming from me because I'm Polina and I work on AI policy at Meta. But one of the main places where I see what you're describing is actually on issue of fairness right now, where the confounding of terms is making it really challenging to talk about fairness, where we who have been working on the AI space for a long time generally think about fairness as protected classes and figuring out a way for these systems to work well for everyone. And there's right now this co-opting of fairness for issues like political bias. So I'm wondering what tools you have at your discretion to help kind of parse those terms.
Yeah, no, the tools we have is definitely just our voice and sort of calling out. But I think fairness is a really good example, and the co-option of fairness didn't just happen in this instance. I think there are many researchers in the room who've also studied this, but I think the sort of crafting bias itself as a sort of technical problem, and then the sort of seamless transition from that to an auditing ecosystem and sort of making auditing the one-stop shop answer for regulatory concerns in ways that were both palatable to industry, but also where the benchmarks and the methodologies themselves were being set in ways that would allow it to become a sort of checkbox certification has been one of the challenges. Like, what is a 100% bias-free system, right, to begin with? And I think part of this is, I'll just put a small plug, as even though I'm a policy person, I think looking to regulation as always being some kind of panacea is also a problem, because sometimes we spend years making the argument that AI entrenches structural forms of discrimination, and then the kind of quick stop solution to that might become an AI auditing mandate, and it might get us to a somewhat more reflexive space, but it may not actually get at the root of the problem, and then we've sort of lost that window of political will. So all that to say, I think like the kind of regulatory solution matters, and I think fairness and bias by their, like all of the other terms like openness, democratization, and many of the other terms being wielded, I think we have to both sort of call out when it gets to a level of abstraction, and also remind people that these terms are actually rooted in enforceable legal mandates and histories. So sort of it's become a little bit tiring almost when we've been working on AI policy for so long, but just sort of reminding people that this stuff didn't just start with ChatGPT, that there have been people working on this and advocating for it for a long time now.
And we'll take this one more.
Oh.
Hi. I'm interested in your thoughts on the EU AI Act, also the Council of Europe treaty that's opened up, and also how that interacts with human rights-based frameworks, and as a possible way forward in terms of global governance, but also for the US?
Yeah, very quickly, I think on the EU AI Act, I'm not as familiar with the Council of Europe's work, but I think what I can say on the EU AI Act is that it is enforceable law, and that takes political will. It has taken more than 5 years of wrangling and diplomatic prowess. So I think it is a really major milestone to have laws on the books, and also a reminder that the effort at AI regulation has been ongoing for many years now. I think there are some challenging aspects to the EU AI Act in that it applies a product safety lens to what are much more complicated rights-based issues, and I think we're going to see or come up against the limits of that kind of a narrow framing. And I think for me it has all of the dangers of the sort of audit checkbox compliance style of regulation for that reason. But again, I think with scrutiny and advocacy, I think there's still a lot that can be done because it's enforceable law. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I think sort of what I'm saying is that I think the other thing to note is I think the discourse around human rights, even more so than risks, has really taken a little bit of a beating in this like innovation over everything else, and is really in some ways marginalized and relegated because it's assumed to be we'll deal with this at like number 10 agenda item kind of thing. And so I think another strategy question to think through is how do we ensure that the human rights agenda is not exclusively relegated to the critique risk side of things, but is also part of the imaginative, positive, visioning part of AI policy. Okay, thank you.